What if the person you loved most was willing to throw you away to protect their own image? Cherry thought she knew heartbreak when the man she secretly loved chose her sister over her. But that was nothing compared to what came next. This is the story of two sisters who grew up in the same house but lived completely different lives. One was loved, praised, and forgiven for everything. The other was forgotten, taken for granted, and expected to fix everyone else's problems without a word of thanks. What happened when their parents' favorite daughter made a mistake so big that it threatened to destroy their family's reputation forever? The quiet sister was forced to pay the price in the most heartbreaking way possible. Cherry and Jane Parker grew up in a small house on Maple Street, where love was never shared equally. Their parents, Martha and Robert Parker, had a way of looking at their daughters that made it crystal clear who was the favorite. Jane was everything they wanted in a daughter. She was loud, confident, and charming. She could walk into any room and make everyone laugh within minutes. She had this magnetic personality that drew people to her like moths to a flame. When Jane spoke, people listened. When she smiled, rooms lit up. When she made mistakes, which she did often, people forgave her instantly because she was just so likable. Cherry was the opposite in every way that mattered to her parents. She was quiet, thoughtful, and responsible. While Jane was out making friends and causing trouble, Cherry was at home doing homework, helping with chores, and making sure everything ran smoothly. She never complained, never asked for attention, and never caused problems. To most people, these would be admirable qualities. But to Martha and Robert, Cherry's quiet nature made her invisible. They saw her reliability as boring and her kindness as weakness. The difference in treatment was obvious to everyone who knew the family. When Jane brought home bad grades, her parents would say she was just going through a phase and needed more support. When Cherry brought home perfect grades, they barely looked at her report card. When Jane broke curfew, they worried she might be having problems and needed to talk. When Cherry came home 5 minutes late because she was helping an elderly neighbor with groceries, they lectured her about responsibility and keeping her word. Jane got new clothes whenever she asked for them because she needed to express her personality. Cherry wore hand-me-downs and clothes from discount stores because she was practical and didn't care about fashion anyway. Jane got driving lessons as soon as she turned 16 because she was mature enough to handle the responsibility. Cherry had to wait until she was 18 and could pay for her own lessons because the family budget was tight. The most painful part for Cherry was watching how her parents' faces changed when they looked at each of their daughters. When they looked at Jane, their eyes sparkled with pride and amusement. They smiled automatically, as if Jane's very presence brought them joy. When they looked at Cherry, their expressions were neutral at best, sometimes even slightly annoyed, as if she was interrupting something more important. Cherry learned early that the best way to get any positive attention was to be useful. She became the family's problem solver, the one who handled difficult situations, the one who cleaned up messes that other people made. She told herself that this was her role in the family and that it was enough. She convinced herself that she didn't need the same kind of love that Jane got because she was different, more independent, stronger. But deep down, Cherry ached for the kind of unconditional love and acceptance that Jane received without even trying. She wondered what it would feel like to have her parents' eyes light up when she walked into a room. She imagined what it would be like to make a mistake and have them rush to comfort her instead of lecture her. She dreamed of being seen as more than just the reliable daughter who could be counted on to handle whatever crisis came up. The Parker family's social circle was small but tight-knit. They had known the Morrison family for over 15 years. Ever since David Morrison's father had helped Robert Parker get his job at the insurance company. David was 3 years older than Jane and 5 years older than Cherry, but he had been a constant presence in their lives since childhood. He was the kind of man that parents loved to see their daughters bring home. He was stable, successful, and came from a good family. He had graduated from college with a business degree and was already climbing the corporate ladder at a prestigious firm. David was handsome in a classic way, with dark hair that he kept perfectly styled and brown eyes that seemed to see right through you. He was tall and athletic, having played basketball in high school and college. He drove a nice car, wore expensive suits, and always smelled like cologne that probably cost more than Cherry's monthly allowance. He was polite to adults, charming to women, and confident in every situation. From the time Cherry was 13 years old, she had harbored a secret crush on David that grew stronger every year. She knew it was hopeless. David was older, more sophisticated, and completely out of her league. But she couldn't help the way her heart raced when he came over for dinner, or the way she found excuses to be in whatever room he was in. She memorized the sound of his laugh, and the way he ran his fingers through his hair when he was thinking. She practiced conversations with him in her mind, imagining witty things she could say that would make him see her as more than just Jane's little sister. But Cherry's feelings for David were destined to remain unrequited because David only had eyes for Jane. From the moment Jane hit 16 and transformed from a gangly teenager into a stunning young woman, David was completely captivated. He would show up at the Parker house with flimsy excuses, hoping to catch a glimpse of Jane. He brought her flowers for no reason, offered to drive her places, and listened to her stories with the kind of attention that most people reserve for their favorite movies. Jane, for her part, seemed to enjoy David's attention, but never took it seriously. She treated him the way she treated all the boys who were interested in her, with casual affection and playful teasing that kept them hoping without ever committing to anything. She would flirt with him just enough to keep him interested, then disappear with her friends and ignore his calls for days. She accepted his gifts and his offers to help her with things, but she never gave him the kind of focused attention that he craved. David's infatuation with Jane was painful for Cherry to watch. She saw how his face changed when Jane walked into a room, the same way her parents' faces changed. She watched him hang on Jane's every word, laugh at jokes that weren't funny, and find excuses to touch her arm or brush against her shoulder. She witnessed him making a fool of himself trying to impress a girl who barely noticed his efforts. The worst part was that Cherry could see what David couldn't or wouldn't see. Jane was never going to love him the way he loved her. Jane was in love with the idea of being in love, but she was too selfish and too immature to actually commit to anyone. She liked the excitement of new relationships, the thrill of conquest, the feeling of being wanted. But she got bored easily and moved on as soon as someone stopped being a challenge. Cherry wanted to warn David, to tell him that he was wasting his time and his heart on someone who would never appreciate him. But she knew that anything she said would sound like jealousy, which it partly was. She also knew that people in love don't want to hear the truth about their beloved, especially not from someone they see as a child. So Cherry kept her feelings and her observations to herself. She watched David chase after Jane with the same hopeless determination that she herself felt when she looked at him. She saw the cycle of hope and disappointment that he went through every time Jane gave him attention and then pulled away. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that he deserved better, that there were other people who would appreciate his devotion. But Cherry remained silent, playing her role as the responsible daughter who didn't make waves or cause problems. She continued to do well in school, help around the house, and stay out of everyone's way. She told herself that her feelings didn't matter, that her role was to support her family, not to pursue her own happiness. She convinced herself that she was stronger than other people, that she didn't need the same things that Jane needed. The dynamic between the three of them continued for years. David pursuing Jane with increasingly desperate gestures. Jane enjoying the attention, but never reciprocating his feelings. Cherry loving David from a distance and hating herself for it. It was a triangle of unrequited love that seemed like it could go on forever, with everyone trapped in their roles and no one willing to break the cycle. None of them could have predicted how dramatically everything would change when Jane made a decision that would shatter their carefully maintained equilibrium and force them all to confront the truth about their relationships with each other. Everything changed on a Tuesday evening in October when Jane burst through the front door with news that would turn their world upside down. She had met someone online, a man named Marcus who lived in Australia. They had been talking for months through video calls and messages, and she was convinced that he was the love of her life. Jane announced that she was leaving in 2 weeks to move to Sydney to be with him. The Parker family was stunned. Jane had never mentioned Marcus before, and the idea of their daughter moving to the other side of the world to be with a stranger was terrifying. Martha cried, Robert shouted, and even Cherry felt sick to her stomach at the thought of her sister disappearing from their lives. But Jane was determined. She was 21 years old, legally an adult, and she had already bought her plane ticket with money she had saved from her part-time job at the boutique. David was devastated. He had been planning to propose to Jane after Christmas, having finally saved enough money for the ring he thought she deserved. He begged her to reconsider, promising her everything he could think of. A bigger ring, a better house, vacations anywhere she wanted to go. He even offered to move to Australia with her if that's what it would take. But Jane was beyond reasoning. She was caught up in the romance of it all, the idea of starting fresh in a new country with someone who didn't know her past or her family's expectations. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of arguments, tears, and desperate attempts to change Jane's mind. Cherry watched her parents fall apart as they realized they couldn't control their favorite daughter's decision. She watched David become a shadow of himself, barely eating or sleeping as he tried to process the reality that Jane was leaving him behind. And she watched Jane pack her bags with excitement, talking nonstop about her new life and the adventures she was going to have. The night before Jane left, she finally had a private conversation with Cherry. They sat on Jane's bed, surrounded by empty drawers and boxes, and for the first time in years, Jane actually looked at her sister with something resembling genuine affection. "I know you think I'm crazy," Jane said, folding her last sweater into her suitcase. "But I have to do this. I can't stay here and live the life that everyone expects me to live. I can't marry David just because he's safe and our parents approve of him. I need something more exciting than that." Cherry wanted to ask what was wrong with safe. What was wrong with being loved by someone who would do anything for you? What was wrong with having a family that supported you even when you made mistakes? But she knew Jane wouldn't understand. Jane had never had to fight for attention or acceptance. She had never known what it felt like to be overlooked or taken for granted. "What about David?" Cherry asked instead. "He's been in love with you for years. This is going to destroy him." Jane shrugged, a gesture that broke Cherry's heart because it was so casual, so dismissive of someone's genuine feelings. "David will be fine. He's a good guy. He'll find someone else who appreciates him more than I do. Maybe someone who actually wants the same things he wants." Cherry wanted to tell Jane that she was that someone, that she had been watching David for years, loving him from a distance, appreciating everything about him that Jane took for granted. But she knew that this wasn't the time or the place for such a confession. Jane was leaving in the morning, and nothing Cherry said would change that. The next morning, the whole family drove Jane to the airport. It was one of the most painful experiences of Cherry's life. She watched her parents cry as they hugged Jane goodbye, telling her how much they loved her and how proud they were of her for following her dreams. She watched David stand apart from the group, his face a mask of controlled pain as he watched the woman he loved walk away from him without looking back. Jane's departure left a hole in the Parker family that seemed impossible to fill. Martha fell into a depression that lasted for months. She stopped cooking elaborate meals, stopped caring about how the house looked, and spent most of her time staring at photos of Jane and crying. Robert threw himself into work, staying late at the office to avoid coming home to a house that felt empty and sad. Cherry found herself trying to fill the void that Jane had left behind. She took over the household tasks that her mother had abandoned, cooked dinners that no one had much appetite for, and tried to keep the family functioning. She also found herself in the strange position of being the one who checked on David, who had become a frequent visitor to their house, even though Jane was gone. David seemed lost without Jane. He would show up at the Parker house in the evenings, sitting in the living room with Robert and talking about work or sports, or anything that would keep his mind off the fact that the woman he loved was building a new life on the other side of the world. Cherry would bring him coffee and listen to him talk about his day, and sometimes she would catch him looking at her with a strange expression that she couldn't quite read. For the first time in her life, Cherry had David's attention. Not because he was interested in her romantically, but because she was the closest thing he had to a connection with Jane. She looked enough like her sister that sometimes David would start to say something to her and then stop, as if he had forgotten for a moment that she wasn't Jane. She had Jane's eyes and Jane's smile, though she had never learned to use them the way Jane did. Cherry treasured these moments with David, even though she knew they were based on her resemblance to someone else. She memorized every conversation they had, every time he laughed at something she said, every moment when he seemed to see her as more than just Jane's little sister. She told herself that this was enough, that she didn't need more than this. But the situation was about to become much more complicated. 3 months after Jane left, she called home with news that shattered what was left of the family's equilibrium. She and Marcus had broken up, The relationship that she had sacrificed everything for had lasted less than 3 months. But instead of coming home, Jane had decided to stay in Australia and try to build a life there on her own. Martha was heartbroken all over again. She had been hoping that Jane would come home once the romance with Marcus ended, that her daughter would realize that family and stability were more important than adventure and excitement. But Jane's decision to stay in Australia felt like a rejection of everything the Parker family represented. The news hit David even harder than Jane's initial departure had. He had been holding on to hope that Jane would come back, that she would realize that what they had was worth